Thanks everyone for coming to this session. I'm Peter Hickman, a PhD student at Harvard, and I'm really glad to be having this chat with Paul Niehaus, who we heard from earlier. So you already got to look at some of the awesome stuff that he's been doing. From my perspective as a PhD student, I've been able to be assigned his papers in classes and talk about them with the other grad students, see him present at the Harvard-MIT Development Seminar, but also admire that you not only do these great studies, but have also gone out and founded several organizations. And in particular, in light of that you have this experience both with rigor and also with the practical side of leading organizations. We're going to have this conversation about how to use RCTs within the context of an existing organization. And I'll try to ask some questions based on what I've learned from people's concerns so far in this conference. But we'll have some time for Q&A at the end as well. So first off, say an organization, they've got a program, maybe it's child sponsorship, maybe it's microfinance, and they're interested in understanding the impact that they're having. That's where they're initially starting out. They've got some M&E. Organizations that we have here seem to have some monitoring and evaluation. Yeah. But they're kind of aware that there's a higher standard of rigor they maybe could aim towards, but they're concerned about cost. They're not exactly sure what they need to do. What are your initial thoughts on advice for them?
Great. Yeah, so obviously there's a lot of terrain there that we can cover and get into, but if it's okay, maybe I'll start with sort of some big picture about impact evaluation, and then we could get into questions about cost and questions about partners that we get to work with and things like that, and sort of go from there. Yeah. So I think the first thing is there's definitely heightened interest in doing RCTs in the sense that that's more important nowadays. There was a Nobel Prize given out to people for RCTs. I think all of this is generally for the good, but I think it's important to think about program evaluation and recognize the part of it that RCTs help with and also the parts that they don't. And so there's deep work, a lot of what we've been talking about today, about first just conceptualizing the goal. What is it that we hope to achieve and how do we even think about that? And there's also a lot of work to do to sort of think about metrics that would capture that and reflect it well, which is also something we've been talking about a lot today. And sort of whether you have randomization or not in your evaluation plan sort of doesn't really affect either of those, right? Where it helps is the counterfactual reasoning bit, right? And so this is a fundamentally hard thing in impact work, which is what we mean definitionally by impact is that the world is different because of what we did than what it could have been. And we never see what it could have been. Right? You can never see both possible worlds, right? The world in which I acted and the world in which I did not. And so, there is this sort of amazing thing that if they're well structured and under certain conditions and assumptions, experiments let you get a good estimate of that, right? By seeing some people who did get the benefits of the intervention, some people who didn't. So very powerful for that. And there have been lots of examples over the years of other ways of trying to reason about those counterfactual worlds that have led us astray and not been very reliable. And so I think that's part of the reason why we sort of really trust experiments. But there are also other good ways of doing it. So for example, in a very simple sense, if I'm running a social impact business and I see that somebody's willing to pay $20 for a solar lantern, it's reasonable to infer that at least from their point of view, the other things they could have done with $20 were not as good, right? And so there's a form of counterfactual reasoning that is happening there that just says we created value for this person because they were willing to pay for the lantern, which I think is also a very powerful form of feedback and counterfactual reasoning. So,
and I think that relates a bit to some of, you can get your perspective on this, but some of what people have been talking about how they can measure how they're doing is trying to get sort of customer satisfaction in a sense, talking to the people that they're serving, seeing what they like and don't like.
Yeah.
How would you compare that method with what you just talked about in terms of is someone willing to pay for this thing?
Yeah. So I think that sort of conversational qualitative work is important to do first. And that's, if we're doing an RCT, we typically want to do some of that at the beginning, which informs then what things we measure quantitatively. I think some of the issues that come up with relying that on alone, especially if you ask people for sort of feedback on a thing you've given them, is that if there's no opportunity cost to them, right, if it's not like they could choose to have had something else, then, it's sort of a why look a gift horse in the mouth than art. You say sure, it was great. Thank you for giving me something. Why would I complain about it? So, asking that question in scenarios where people have some real say, where they could say, well, you spent $100 and gave me a cow, but actually if you had spent the $100 on clean water or some other thing, that would have been even better for me. That's where I think it starts to become.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you're saying if all I'm doing is I'm asking you, how much did you like this cow? 10 out of 10, people can say 10. It's great. But you're not necessarily learning how that how that affects them, or how much do they prefer that relative to something else, which could be cheaper or better for them.
Yeah, for that you either need to do the experiment where you're comparing two things and looking at impacts, or asking people for their preferences, what they would choose if they had some say in it. Those are like more meaningful ways, I think, of comparing alternatives. Yeah.
And earlier you were saying that there's kind of like, it seemed like you were saying there were these 3 steps to like doing an impact evaluation. The first is you've got to think about what is it that conceptually like we think we want to know if we're affecting, and then second is we have to figure out how exactly we're going to measure it. And then once you're measuring it, you can then start to think about also the counterfactual, and that's where potentially randomization is super helpful.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
So now a lot of folks at different orgs here, they collect some data, not necessarily doing the full impact evaluation with randomization yet. And people have mentioned various concerns about actually randomizing. Could be that they don't seem to just have a waiting list of people that they can easily choose who does or who doesn't get it.
Yeah.
But maybe within the organizations you've worked with, what are practical obstacles you've seen to doing that kind of randomized evaluation, and how do you overcome them?
Yeah. So I think there are like sort of 2 big things. One is sort of the ethics of it and the experience of being assigned something, for arbitrary reasons. And then the other is just sort of the cost of it. You'll often hear people talk about the sort of costs and the time associated with doing RCTs as a reason not to. And I think there's some nuance there because literally the act of randomization is very cheap and very quick, right? So that's not actually the thing that makes an RCT expensive. Like you could do that right now in Excel, or it would take like 5 seconds.
Right.
So there's like potentially a part of like randomization that can be costly for an organization, which is if you need to identify a larger group of people that could have received the program, so that you can then randomize within them, right? If it's costly to identify that potential beneficiary set, right? You need twice as many, let's say. There's some cost there. But I think the thing that's usually actually really costly and slow is actually the measurement. Right? It's the time it takes to go out and measure outcomes, and to do that carefully. And if you want to know like what are the impacts after a year or two, you have to wait for a year or two, right? That's just like tautological, right? So that's a reality of life that we have to accept. Yeah. And so I think that's true whether you're evaluating using randomization as your identification strategy or other techniques. So, in terms of the ethics, you already sort of brought up like scenarios where there are more people that you'd like to help than you can, and those are scenarios in which I feel very comfortable about randomization, that it's sort of both a useful device for learning and also ethically fair, right? In the sense that everybody has at least the same a priori chance of getting help. What I think I feel very sensitive about is situations where 2 people maybe live next to each other, they're observationally equivalent, they both satisfy the criteria for participating in the program, one of them gets it and one of them doesn't. And to them, it just feels like an act of God, that like, why is it that I'm unlucky and my neighbor's lucky? And I think that can be a bad experience. And so at Give Directly over time, we've tended to move away from these like small scale evaluations that feel like that towards larger scale ones where we're like ordering the rollout in which we go into different communities. So that it's, like over time we're going to get to every place, but we'd like to randomize the order. And so I think there are things like
and it's community level, so the neighbors are all experiencing the same thing.
That's right. It's community level. And so I sort of feel better about those designs. Those are more expensive because now you're talking about like larger units, but you also learn more because you start to learn about some of the aggregate impacts which you care about. So, those are some of the ethical trade-offs we've had to navigate. I guess the last thing I'd say about the ethics of, it's not really the ethics of experimenting per se. It's really the ethics of intervening. At all, whether there's an experiment or not. But like one thing that's kind of I've been grappling with a little bit is that we ask individual consent to participate in the things we do, but the things we do always have broader impacts, right? And so you saw this in the study that there were these like broader positive impacts, right? That there was like a multiplier effect on the community, but there can easily be negative impacts as well. And so I don't think we have good frameworks for thinking about consent for that. Maybe that it's like local government agrees that this is a good thing, but I think that's like an important ethical issue in the back of my mind. But it's not unique to experiments.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Just the fact that you're doing anything at all, you have to think about not just that individual, but others and how they might be affected.
Yeah. If I help you set up a small dairy business, there's some other guy whose dairy business may suffer a bit because of that. And that's economics, right? That's just like how things work. And so it doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but like the ethical framework that says since you consented to participate in this, it's okay, and doesn't take that into account, doesn't feel quite enough.
Okay. Yeah, so it's good to think about the broader impact. And if you think the broader impact may be negative, then you try to consult with the community, or maybe you just don't do the thing.
Yeah, or we're learning about these kinds of aggregate impacts so that we can have some review and safeguards built in there. But
Got it. And in terms of timing, when to do an evaluation, whether it's randomized or just some other data collection where you've got another identification method. What are the right times to do that? And relatedly, like, what is the value of doing that? Are there times when you shouldn't do it?
Measure outcomes.
Measure outcomes? Well, yeah, measure outcomes, but maybe we can focus on the case of doing an RCT. You're going to randomize, you're going to do a baseline, you're going to do an end line, you're going to measure something. It all sounds good, but of course it's costly.
Yeah.
So what's kind of the right time to do that, or the right situation?
Yeah. So I mean, I think a lot of that is probably very context specific, and maybe like people have decisions they're grappling with, and we can talk about those, and that would be a good way to get into that. But I think sort of two thoughts on that. One is that I've realized that like we sort of care about all moments in somebody's life, not just about like one particular moment. And so these designs where we come and do an end line once and see how are people doing a year afterwards or something like that, certainly informative. But I'm actually sort of now, over time, I prefer more design where we sort of survey like 10% of people every month or something like that, and on a rolling basis get some sense of like, and so you can also potentially get some sense of the dynamics and the trajectory out of that. But like really sort of like valuing every moment in people's lives equally feels like the right ethical approach. And so it's nice to be able to reflect that in the timing of measurement.
I see.
And then the other thing is I think there's this common challenge that we often do things hoping to see impacts over the very long run. That like decades later, people's lives will be better,
right.
Kids' lives will be better. And it takes a long time to see that. And so we could potentially do that work and measure those outcomes a long time later. But are there things we can see in like year one or year two that indicatively tell us like things are headed in the right direction, right? And so there is like statistical work around that, around the problem of surrogate measures, as it's called, which is kind of like in its early days. But that's also, I think, a useful tool to have in your toolkit.
And then in terms of the usefulness, like we saw Lincoln present yesterday on some of the work that he's done with Dean Carlin, these really sophisticated RCTs. Yep. But then at the end, I don't know if you've talked to him much about this, but he was kind of concluding like, well, from me as an implementer, I'm not sure what to do. We've got this ambiguous effect.
Yeah.
We've got all these conflicting effects that the academics are arguing about. Also, I'd like to just know how do I make my program more effective, and they don't seem to know exactly what I should do.
Yeah.
So is that just something that's going to happen a lot, or maybe that will happen, but are there ways to design your evaluation that will prevent the chance that you'll kind of just get a result you can't interpret?
Yeah, totally, yeah. So I mean, like the sort of, in theory, the right way, I think the good way to think about this is that you want to have some sort of like value of information framework that you say like the purpose of the exercise is to create information, and it's an investment like many other investments, and we need a way to think about the value of that to assess whether it's really worth doing. You could do a very complicated mathematical version of that, but I actually think for a lot of people and organizations, the simple exercise of like, what are some possible results of this that would cause me to make a decision differently is like very powerful, right? Because like I often ask people that question about things they're planning about doing and they can't come up with an answer, at least right away.
I see.
And so, that's a very low bar, but I think that's a good place to start. And it would push you to start thinking about things like, well, if I'm planning to measure 10 different outcomes and I end up seeing effects on some and not others, like would that change anything that I do? What would I do in that case? And if not, if I would end up feeling like this is murky, I don't know what to do, maybe you want to change the study and do it differently. Maybe you want to narrow this down to like one thing that you think is the core thing.
Right.
And you also probably think about how big you want your study to be, right? So I think a lot of studies end up being too small, right? In the sense that they do have a high chance of returning results that are like not clearly zero, but also not clearly positive. And those leave us wondering what to do, right? And so academics will design studies and size them to have a good chance of rejecting the hypothesis of no impact, because that's like what our incentives are built around. And that's not a bad thing to do, but like that's actually not necessarily the right way to think about it for organizational decision making, which is more around like what kinds of estimates would make us change our mind and do something differently. And so I would really encourage people to do that.
So like for the cash benchmarking research that you cited there, in some sense, you want to know, is this training that we're doing affecting people's consumption more than cash is? That's maybe one thing. But I realize in those contexts, they were kind of just looking at a variety of outcomes.
Yeah.
But I can see how, there's, besides just, are we doing something? You can ask like, are we doing something that's better than something else than we could be doing for some outcome?
Right,
or
exactly.
Given the amount of money that we're spending, like, can we test that this is meeting some cost effectiveness measure?
Yeah, so like GiveDirectly's sort of theory or value framework for the early studies we did was like, we're going to look for impacts on the things that we think could be self-harmful that people often worry about. And if we see evidence of those things, like that would be, cause us to actually shut the thing down. But if we don't, then we don't have a sort of particular metric that we think is like the measure of well-being. Although I like our conversations this morning about like holistic measures, which I think are really valuable. Our purpose is more to put this out there and use it to sort of provoke reflection and thought on the part of donors, right? But then there are also studies where we said like we're going to compare two different ways of doing things, and we're actually going to quantify the impact of those, and that will determine which of the two things we do in the future. And those are valuable for internal decision making. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's kind of like the techie A/B test version. Like we've got the A version and the B version. We think maybe the A is better than the B. We're not sure.
Yeah.
We're going to roll them both out. And if our study is kind of large enough, we think we'll be able to get some information about which one is going to be better at the outcome that we care about.
Yeah.
But then there's this other reason to do an impact evaluation, which I think is kind of common, which is it'd be really nice to be able to tell maybe certain donors that we're having an impact.
Right.
And that's the case where then if you get, a large confidence interval includes 0, it's kind of like, well, we're not really sure what to do.
Yeah. And I think there's an even worse problem with that, which is there's a lazy habit of saying, if the confidence interval is large, it means we didn't find an effect, right? Which is not what it means. But that is like a real issue, right? I think like it's actually very risky for organizations to run an underpowered study because the narrative may then be it doesn't work, right?
Yeah. So all to say, you can design a study, and if it goes one way, you'll be happy, but there may be a lot of ways where you're not sure how to interpret it. So it's careful in the design phase to think about what you're doing. Yeah. Now, some of this is very technical, the work that's involved. So do you think it's best for organizations to think about kind of having people internally that can do it versus partnering with, say, academics? What are those partnerships like?
Yeah. So definitely, there are organizations, right, that are big enough to have an internal research function, and that's a great way to sort of like invest in learning as sort of an organizational priority and to signal that to people that like learning is an organizational priority. And so, we're talking a lot about this very tactical, like do an RCT or not do an RCT decision, which is a good one. It's an interesting decision, but there is this strategic level of thinking like how do we make learning as an organization a priority and communicate that and embed that in culture that we really want to think and learn quantitatively, right? So.
Right.
So yeah, absolutely. Then obviously, of course, there are like times and places where that's you're not at that scale. It doesn't make sense. In terms of like the landscape of external partners and analysts you could work with, there are a bunch. I think the ones that we've worked with at Give Directly have we've worked with academics, and we've also worked with organizations like Ideas 42 or ID Insight in particular in a couple of projects. And so that sort of there are these two different segments. Where with the academics you're going to get really, really smart people potentially willing to work for free, but who also have objectives and interests that aren't always going to be fully aligned with yours, and so you just have to figure that out and figure out is there enough commonality of interest to do this.
Right. I got the sense from Lincoln's talk that some of the things maybe the academics wanted were not necessarily the organization's top priorities.
Yeah, I think there's like both good and bad because like a lot of times people complain about academics just want to publish papers, and so there is some of that. There are also academics who like have published papers and get that, and they're like, I really want my life to be about more than publishing papers, right? And I get a lot of those people because of like the stuff I've done who come to me and they're like, I want my life to be about more than getting a paper into the top journal, right? So just know that there are people like that out there. But then the other thing I'd flag about that is that like sometimes the knowledge that you generate as an organization is useful not just for your own decision making, but it's also like much more broadly useful, right? And can inform what a lot of other organizations and other decision makers do. And that's part of the role of the academic is I think to look for those generalizable insights and lessons. And so there's a part of that I would hope you'd be open to and not resent, right? That's part of the function of academic researchers. So, but yeah, then for situations where it really is like a very specific to us thing, we want to do it quickly, we want to do it exactly the way we have in mind. That's kind of the reason that organizations like ID Insight came into being is really to kind of fill that niche and satisfy that. So we've had great experiences working with them as well, for example. Yeah.
Got it. So the academics, there's some potential drawbacks, but a lot of positives. And then you can sometimes work with these kind of consulting organizations as well. Yeah. Who may be more expensive.
Yeah.
But like that's the thing they do.
Yeah. And it's been interesting for me living on both sides, both as a researcher who sometimes talks to implementers about doing research, and also as Give Directly who gets bombarded by researchers who are like, "Hey, can we do this cool study and use your NGO as a platform for it?"
Right.
Where I'm like,
bombarded.
Yes, bombarded. Where like a lot of people, I'm like, well, you got to understand, like the organization has like strategy and objectives and priorities, and like we do things that fit in with those, and we don't do things that don't. And so you kind of researchers need to be aware of that, right? They're not always. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Something else that's come up a bit in people's interests is this question of like using evidence and whether it's randomization or some other form of evidence to make decisions versus kind of trying to rely on God's direction since we're Christians.
Right.
So like usually we believe we can pray, we can get a sense from the Lord maybe of what we're supposed to do. How maybe for yourself or others you've seen, how can those things both be happening?
Right. So this one I would love to have conversation around and hear from others in the room if there's interest. I would say that for me personally, there have been times in life when I felt like, oh, that's such a good question. That's such a hard thing. How do I even get my head around that? But like descriptively, I just don't think for myself or for other people, I've heard of many cases where those two things were in deep conflict. Like I just can't think of too many examples of anybody I know who's like, you know what, Paul, all the data said X, but God really told me not X. And so, like that just situation doesn't seem to come up all that often in my lived experience. It doesn't, like when I read like the Gospels, it doesn't seem like Jesus felt a lot of tension between this. Like he would talk about being like shrewd stewards, parable of talents, these kinds of things, using our heads, getting a good return on investment. He wasn't like, oh, and by the way, this may be hard because sometimes I'll tell you to do the opposite. Like that just didn't seem like a big issue he wanted to put on our radar. So, and there are like some cool examples I've heard where they're very much aligned. So I don't know if you've read Purpose Driven Church, by Rick Warren, I liked a lot more than I expected to like. And long story. But like the way he decided to plant his Saddleback was he did all this analysis and said, figured demographically, census data, whatever, this is the place that's going to be like the most underchurched in 10 years if we don't plant a church there. And so I'm going to go to Saddleback. And so then he wrote to whatever, like regional administrator, to ask for support to plant a church in Saddleback. And apparently that crossed with like a letter coming back to him from them asking, unsolicited if he would like to plant a church in Saddleback. Which, so I'm like, I think there's some stories like that are really cool where like revelation and research kind of line up, as you say. So
right.
Yeah.
It's God's universe.
Yeah.
And like he's given us things that we can learn.
Yeah. I think generally speaking, and I would love to hear more directively from God, but like my experience of like following God is that like he gives us a pretty good sense of his heart, like what's important to him. He gives us a good head, and he says like, get to work. Right? Yeah.
I'm gonna ask one more question before taking Q&A. If people have more questions given this conversation we've been having. So this other question is about interaction with funders and the role of evidence. In conversations with people, I can see that a lot of the people here like evidence, but they're not sure that they can get resources from their group to invest more in evidence. And part of that's because there's a question of like, from a fundraising side, will this help us generate more funds?
Yeah.
We're going to have to pay for this. And if you think, well, our organization gets funds, without having this type of RCT evidence, do we really need it? So you helping run Give Directly, acquired funding, and with your other organizations as well. So in your experience, how can this data be leveraged to affect fundraising?
Yeah.
Or maybe it can't.
Well, so a couple things. I mean, first, just like in terms of like objectively speaking, in a world where we could just rationally allocate money, like would it often be good to run evaluations? I think like the math often works out that you should. So like if you're spending $10 million a year, let's say, on an intervention, and you think there's only a 5% chance that running an evaluation would convince you not to, right? That means it's worth spending up to $500,000 on the evaluation, right? Which is like very basic math, right? Could repurpose it to something else. And so I think that like, especially if there's something we haven't really tested, we don't know if it works, typically the answer is, yeah, it makes sense to do some evaluation of it once you get to any kind of meaningful scale. Yeah?
So you're kind of saying, if you have unrectived funds, you just like,
yes,
I have I have some money, I can do whatever I want with it.
Yeah.
I'm helping people with it, I think.
Yeah.
If I evaluate it, that means I'm helping fewer people, but you're saying, well, you may not be helping people as much as you think, or maybe there's something else you could be doing.
Yeah.
So an expected value, it's worth.
Yeah, I'm saying like a 5% chance of saving $10 million a year, right? Or just $10 million, right? The stuff that I would have spent on stuff that wasn't worth spending, that's worth $500,000, right?
Right.
It's just
and that could pay for a pretty big.
It's just very basic algebra, right? So I actually think the algebra of this stuff, even if the RCT you think is going to be very expensive, is often quite favorable. But yeah, you're right that like, not everybody sees it that way. Funders are tricky. We know that. Look, Give Directly, especially in its early years, we focused on raising money from people that were very quantitative and very evidence focused. And so those were like, they were very supportive of that and would often encourage us to build things in. To be honest, one of the things that was weird about Give Directly, and this may be very different from the problems you all are facing, is that there are like a lot of times where we found it easier to raise money for cash transfers if the point was to evaluate the impact of the transfers than just to raise money for cash transfers per se. Right? Because we talk to a lot of people who are like, okay, like, yeah, I get it. I could just give my money to someone who has less money than me. That doesn't seem like all that catalytic or profound. Like, but if we could generate new knowledge and that would like be leveraged and impact the rest of the sector, right? So there's this funny thing, right, where I think everybody wants to be like leveraging their impact and influencing what other people do. So like there were times when I would raise money for cash transfers by telling people it's going to be part of an RCT when I thought the main value was the transfers. Actually.
Wow.
So, but like I said, I think we're playing in a somewhat unusual funding mix in terms. It's a lot of Silicon Valley, a lot of very quantitative money, and so not everybody's like that. I think with like more traditional funders, it is important to say like that this matters, and if you agree that it matters, it's got to be built into the grant agreement, right? To push for that, yeah. And one thing that's good is there are a bunch of like new entities that have sprung up in the last 5-10 years to kind of support more impact evaluation and pay for these kinds of things. So they're like, granting sources now like Global Innovations Fund or Development Innovations Ventures, places like this that are like heavily focused on supporting this and this only that didn't exist 10 years ago, right? So,
by this, you mean evaluations?
Yeah, primarily, right? And so, it's perhaps there's still not nearly as much money as allocated to it as one would like, but there are like opportunities now that didn't exist not too long ago.
I see. Yeah. Thanks. Questions from others? Yeah, Bryce.
I'll start really general, and then I can get more specific until you're basically doing my job for me if you want. Suppose you were hired by an organization that has some programs they're doing, and they were either unable or unwilling to randomize. But you otherwise had a lot of resources and energy and time to put towards evaluating those programs. What would your strategy be to evaluate the impact if you cannot randomize the rollout of the programs?
I see.
Obviously, there's a lot of different directions you go with that, a lot of tools.
Yeah. Are you thinking in terms of like other ways to get pretty good counterfactual reasoning if like experimentation is off the table?
Experimentation's off the table, yeah. Exactly. Getting counterfactuals or, qualitative, focus groups, like some combination of all of the different ways that you could elicit the best picture of whether or not these programs are impactful.
Great. Yeah, so I think the sort of two most immediate things, which I think are also like pretty transparent and like easy to explain to people, like why it's a decent strategy, are things where there's some threshold for eligibility, and you can start to compare people who are like just qualified this year and did not, had to wait for some sort of discontinuity in that. And then the other thing would be any setting where you're rolling something out over time to more and more communities. And there, like a really critical thing is going to be you want to understand if I see that like there's a difference, right? Is it really because this guy got the program earlier than that guy? Or is it because they were just on fundamentally different trajectories? And I'm picking that up. And so if you want to be able to do that design, the sort of, for nerds, for tech people, the sort of diff and diff, or the sort of two-way fixed effect type designs, then like starting to gather information about those trajectories that communities or people are on, that's what's going to make them like really credible and really high quality. So like those would be two things to think about. To go looking for, are there places where there are some eligibility thresholds that we could make use of? And then the second is, are there places where we could start to track outcomes for places even before they get the intervention that would let us like build these really credible sort of diff and diff type estimators.
Yeah, and these papers are very common in the top levels of econ, these quasi-experimental things. So as long as you have the right context. Yeah. So James?
Let's just pick up on that. You talked about how potentially a lower number of metrics regularly captured so that you actually capture kind of someone's well-being in the moment. Could be more valuable, which I love. I think there's other sectors that do this really, really well. How would you combine that with then a robust methodology of demonstrating impact?
Well, I think the context in which I was suggesting that fewer metrics might be better is that like if you measure 20 things and you see like positive impacts on some and maybe you can't tell on some others and maybe negative impacts on one or two, that's sort of like a little bit paralyzing for decision making. Or at a minimum, you sort of kick the can down the road in terms of saying, now I have to decide how much I value all these things, and maybe you could have done some of that earlier and said like, what's the essential thing, right? So, so that was sort of the sense in which I was thinking about it. Does that?
And what about the kind of, so that's the kind of number of metrics, which I agree with, be lean, work out what you really care about. But with regard to the kind of measuring things more frequently,
I see that.
And then how you might, because you could just do that, but then arguably not have a robust method, and have a nice graph or shit, but
changes over time,
but you wouldn't necessarily have the counterfactual or the trajectory you just mentioned. So you talk about a combination of like
Yes.
nice sort of more real-time data and
Yeah.
then making that robust to have attribution and causality.
I see. Yeah. In general, I think the sort of pre-post without a sort of thoughtfully defined control group thing is the thing that scares me, and where I think we often lead ourselves astray. There are like a bunch of classic examples of this in social sciences. There's a very common phenomenon that sort of like people will like select into getting help at times when things are bad. And, there's some natural tendency for things to get less bad after that, which would have been true even if you had not. So, if I show up to like ask for unemployment assistance, right? There's conditional on being unemployed today. There's always some chance I'm going to find a job tomorrow, right? So like I can't get less unemployed, right? It's going to tend to drift back up. And so there have been a lot of situations where we sort of misinterpreted that as being the impact of the thing that I went to for help, when in fact some of it was just the natural tendency for people that were like in a bad place to get to a somewhat less bad place, right? So there's sort of dynamics like that to be very cautious about, right? That I'm very cautious about in a lot of these settings. So that said, maybe part of the insight in what you were saying is that if you have things at a very high frequency, and I see that like, the day before you came in, things were really bad, and then the day after, things got really better, and there's this really discrete step, right? There are some things like that you could see in the data that might give us a bit more confidence, right? I think what's tough about that is most of the things we do take time to have an effect, right? So you're not going to see that like literally the day after, your life was transformed. You're going to see that over time it started to make a difference. And so, that's where to me having the control group that you can really trust is really important.
Right.
Yes.
Hello. I have like kind of two questions that are related. I think one of the beauties of RCT is it has perfect internal validity, but sometimes I worry about like the external validity, especially because like not only in different places but different moments and generations in time. And I think so. First, it's like how do you ensure that this RCT, whatever you run in a scale, has like this sort of generalizable. But secondly, on top of that, are there sort of like one of the things when I do research, right? One of the things that I think perhaps helps with the external validity is if you maybe do a very similar experiment in another setting. But I feel like in academics, you want to be the first person to publish in a specific idea. So if it was already published, then you don't want to run the same study to like kind of test the external validity. So in those kind of instances, like how do you, like first it's like how do you ensure external validity, but how do you work against the incentive to test the external validity if you're like the second publisher in that kind of idea?
Cool. Yeah, those are great questions. So the to your first, I love the question. I don't really love the terminology external validity, and so I like how you said generalizability. I sort of like that. But what I don't like about it is like, you're familiar with Hume's paradox?
I'm sorry?
Hume's paradox. It's this sort of like very basic point about epistemology that like, as I understood it, he sort of said, how do we know that the sun is going to rise tomorrow? He said, well, we say, it rose yesterday. And we say, well, how do we know that the fact that it rose yesterday means that it's going to rise tomorrow? And you say, well, you could go back 2 days and say, like, in the past, every time it's risen before, it then rose again. But, at some point, you're just making an assumption, right? An extrapolative assumption. And so that's actually just like a fundamental feature of knowledge, of like learning. And so somehow in these conversations about internal versus external validity, this thing, which I think is actually very deep and universal to learning, sort of gets conflated into like a pro and con of different methods of evaluation, which feels like weird to me, So anyway, I think that the sorts of things you can do practically to help with that are twofold. One is to be thoughtful about like the sample within which you're running your initial evaluation, right? If you can run it within a sample that's representative of a much larger population, that's really powerful because then you can say these results are representative for this much larger population, right? Or maybe you can't do exactly that, but you can think about, we're running this here, but we'd like to then be able to think about the next 3 countries that we're considering expanding into. And so are there some features in which we'd like the samples to look similar? We'd like to include some parts of this country because they look more like that country, right? So there are things like that. The second part of that, which then sort of like comes to your second question about like as a researcher, how can I, you're right? Like the kind of incentives to do this are not great, right? And that is perhaps a bit of an issue, and perhaps we need new journals and new standards that like reward it. I do think one thing that can be effective is there's this sort of like very reductionist empirical style of work these days where you're like, oh, the effects here were this, here they were that, who knows, they're different, we don't really know, it wasn't externally validated, which is not very helpful. Like what economics is supposed to do is to help us reason about precisely that. Like to give us frameworks for thinking about the world that help us understand why effects might be different in different places and what are the deeper reasons for that. And so asking those kinds of questions can get you into some really great, interesting economics, right? Like why might some intervention have a big impact on employment in this labor market but not in that labor market, right? And so that can actually lead, I think, to some really cool insights. You want to follow up?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that part of the question, I think, was really interesting because does that necessarily imply that you need to complement your RCTs with like a theoretical model in order to make like these to make like kind of statements regarding optimality or like general, I can't really talk today, optimality and stuff like
That's
that,
right.
or is it possible to make those reasoning and rationale without like these formal theoretical models?
Yeah. Well, I'd say, yes, you want to be thinking conceptually about those kinds of deeper issues, and sort of mathematical, theoretical models we use are a very helpful tool for that. Right. So,
I could also take this past conversation was like definitely really good for the academics. I could maybe say that there's, I mean, it's really good for me. But I would think from a practitioner perspective, there's kind of a reverse thing going on here where evidence exists. So much evidence exists on microfinance, and so many people do microfinance.
Yeah.
But we already know from the evidence that like it could be, it seems like maybe it's very helpful for certain gung-ho entrepreneurs. And maybe like it helps the average person, but in a different way.
Yeah.
And so if you're a practitioner, then you've got, you can look at the research some.
Yeah.
There is this need to kind of see what is going on in these studies and how similar is that to my context.
Yeah.
Right?
That's right. Yeah. That's a great, I love that way of flipping it. So I think too, I don't know like how you all experience it. There's like some sense in the research community that it's important to have kind of accessible summaries, things that like, a practitioner could go and read to understand what we're learning, and some effort to do that. My suspicion is that like that's always going to be pretty limited, and that we actually have to invest more in relationship across the boundaries, that like you want to have somebody you can call who kind of like talk you through how to think about stuff that you trust.
You mean you think the accessible summaries?
Like you want to have
researchers
like
produce.
a microfinance buddy, right?
Okay.
Right?
So you're saying rather than me just like, no, I can go read the report as a practitioner, instead it's better if like I know like the PhD person who
like I think the intent
talks
behind
about.
Producing those accessible summaries is very good. I think there is some value there, but my suspicion is that like certainly in terms of like high level policy making, like those guys don't read the briefs. They call somebody they trust and say, how should I think about this thing we're thinking about doing, right? So I just kind of put that out there as a question that might be interesting to discuss as a group. So. But yeah, I think that like part of the problem there is that like you're gonna get a bunch of, maybe you'll get like a meta-analysis, right? As they say, that will say like, here we've taken some sort of average of the effects from a bunch of studies, which doesn't really get to your question, which is like I really want to understand the heterogeneity and like why it is that it seems to work better in some places than others, and is there some insight that I can glean from that, right? So I don't think that we do a great job of communicating about that sort of thing, right? And which kind of comes back to my first point, that I think that like building better communication would be helpful. Yeah.
I guess like continuing with that line of thought, do you think within academia and within economics research there's enough work done on trying to understand why things work in a certain way and the mechanisms behind it?
I don't think there's enough.
Yeah. So I guess like trying to solve
and
this
to be
problem.
clear, like there's this knee jerk, like if you ask somebody like an economist, they'll always say like, well, we need to do more research, right? It's kind of so there are
the alternative is like, oh, there's
Yes.
no more research.
like in fact there are some things on which I think we should stop doing research, just to be clear. Like I think it's no longer a high social value use of resources, but like this sort of thing I think is actually where we have a lot to add, comparative advantage.
Yes, Sylvia.
Yeah, so I'm just interested to find out for the couple of researches that you have done. There is usually assumptions that we make even when you're doing RCTs on the control group,
Right.
and then the counterfactual group.
Yeah.
So I'm just interested to find out if, for the couple of researches you've conducted, have you seen external factors kind of affect your results?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. So I've spared you all this because it now is going to get like, perhaps a bit technical and painful. And, I've told you that experiments are great, and now I'm going to tell you that actually there's a deep problem with them. So the deep issue as I see it, and this has come from running some of these larger scale experiments we've done, is that like, I don't think there ever really is a control group, at least in a strict sense. Like we live in this deeply interconnected world. All of us affect each other in ways that are hard to trace out. I mean, but a lot of economics is about this. It's about understanding the different, like, the rich ways in which we're interconnected and impact each other. So I don't think there's any way that I give somebody $1,000 and it doesn't, in some small way at least, affect everybody else in their community, right? So where's the control group, right? And so I don't think that like our discipline has fully come to terms with that tension yet. We sort of still live in this like world where we're like, well, hopefully these people weren't impacted too much, and so it's okay, right? I have been doing some like new work on this, which I'm very excited about, which is thinking about suppose that instead of that really strong assumption that like here are some people that were not impacted, we're comfortable assuming that say like the effects decay the further away you get, right? So it turns out the math gets way more complicated really quickly, but you can actually still do some really powerful and cool things. And so to me, that's an exciting research frontier to say something about that. But I'd say that at a minimum, just being sensitive to that fact that like this is always an approximation. It's never going to be entirely true because our world is interconnected. I think that's important. Yeah.
I think we might have time for one last question. Yeah, one more. So we've got.
Yeah, so I guess like most of us are in the business of power sharing. Like we're trying to see communities take greater ownership and agency. What if knowledge is power? In doing a study like an RCT, how can we ensure that the knowledge that's generated is owned by the people we're serving, not by us? And also, how can we, I guess, support like through country officers, etc., local staff to be delivering a lot of this? And is that possible?
Yeah, so I mean, where we're at right now is there's sort of, typically an expectation that anything that you do is going to get through a sort of ethics review board, both at like your home university, but also in the place where you're operating. And so that's good practice, right? For NGOs too, right? If there's no academic involved, right? To have that sort of local ethics board look at something. And then I think sometimes, part of the ethics plan is going to be to like promise to share the results with people who participate if they're interested in learning about the results so that at least they have like basic levels of access to it. But I think that's very different from them like setting the learning agenda and saying like, here's the stuff that we'd be interested in. And so I have been pushing on that a little bit. I've been saying like the way a lot of research funding gets allocated right now is you have to get a letter of support from someone that says like, yes, we think this would be a good thing to do. But it has that gift horse problem that I mentioned earlier, right? Which is that they don't have the opportunity to say like, it would actually be better to do this other thing, right? All they can say is like, yes or no. I'd like to see this happen. So I think it would be great to have more research funded allocated where there's like input, like real decision-making power from like local communities, local government, the people who are being studied, who are the subjects of the thing. So I'd love to see more of that. That's something like I feel strongly enough about that I would personally spend time on it actually, just to say that, like if there are funders that want to do that, I would do that, yeah.
You're saying you would spend time saying
building
the
like a research funding program where like the communities being studied have real say in which studies get funded. Yeah, like if somebody wanted to fund that, I would spend time on that.
Okay, so there's an opportunity out there for someone. Thanks so much for sharing all this. It's been super fun for me.
Yeah, thank you all.